Good afternoon and welcome to ASA's Safety Webinar. I'm Michael Place, Training Director for Dakota Supply Group and the Chairman of ASA's Safety Committee. Each month, the Safety Committee publishes articles and toolbox talks on a variety of safety-based subjects. These can be viewed and downloaded from the ASA website at www.asa.net. Also available on the ASA site are recordings and downloads of previous webinars. All of these items are available free to the public. To view these resources, look for the Safety Resources link on the ASA homepage, which is located at www.asa.net. If you have any problems, contact Dan Hilden at the ASA for assistance. At this time, I'd like to draw your attention to ASA's supplier partners shown on the screen. They are very important to the work that we do. The Safety Committee would like to thank them for their industry leadership and for supporting our committee and these webinars. This webinar is being recorded for later viewing. Everyone that registered for the webinar will receive an email notifying them when and where the replay of the webinar is available. Attendees will also receive an emailed link to its location. All attendees are in mute mode. To submit a question during the presentation, you can enter it in the chat window. Before you send it, be sure the setting is set to send the question to our organizers and the panelists so we can see the question. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation as time allows. Also, a FAQ document with all questions and answers will be posted on the ASA site along with the replay of the webinar. Other related documents will also be posted in that location as well. I would now like to turn our attention toward today's event. Today's webinar is presented by Brady Corporation. Brady Corporation is an international manufacturer and marketer of complete solutions that identify and protect premises, products, and people. Its products help customers increase safety, security, productivity, and performance, and include high-performance labels and signs, printing systems and software, and safety devices. Today's presentation title is How to Create Proper Procedures and Written Programs for Lockout Tagout. This webinar is the first of two parts. The second Lockout Tagout webinar, covering auditing and best practices and training requirements, will take place on April 7th. Our presenter for this webinar is Scott Stone. Scott is the Brady Safety Solution owner at Brady Corporation. He is a safety professional with 15 years experience in building safety management systems and inspection and auditing processes. He is also certified Six Sigma Black Belt for advanced statistical and problem-solving techniques to improve effectiveness and efficiency. A full bio of the presenter will be posted with the webinar documents on the ASA website. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to Scott Stone. Scott.
All right, thanks, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Lockout Tagout program creation and proper procedure. A lot of the discussion today is going to be based on some of my personal experience with developing and implementing lockout programs. I've been involved with some of the highly successful programs where all the elements are in place and you have that great employee buy-in. To the programs that really are non-existent, kind of starting from scratch, or the ones that are very fragmented and need a little help, or some that they're just not quite being followed. They're in place, but the employees really aren't engaged with that program. So the agenda today, we'll start with the discussion of the elements of a successful program. We'll talk a little bit about the program itself and talk about some tips on how to create an effective program. And then we'll finish the discussion by covering some of the equipment-specific lockout procedures. It was kind of a little bit backwards from the title of the training, but I thought this would be a little better way to go at it. So what are the elements of a successful lockout program? Some think that having the locks, the devices, the lockout stations hanging around the plant or in the maintenance shop, or having the isolation points labeled is all that it takes. Really that's all you need for a lockout program. In reality, these are the tools for a lockout tagout program. Don't get me wrong, these are very important tools, but they are tools, and it's only scratching the surface when we talk about an effective and successful lockout program. Some companies focus very heavily. Sometimes they focus solely on these tools, and they can get by for a long time with no issues. Unfortunately, this gives them kind of a false sense of security. Again, I've done many program reviews, and I've seen a lot of these elements in place when we talk about the tools. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you start finding some of the gaps in the process elements. The things like not having a group lockout process, not having a shift change process. Employees not applying lockout in the field, or maybe not having that understanding of how to use those tools or devices, and that's really where you need to focus. Consider this. In 2015, proper lockout device application, using the tools, was only the 5th most cited section of the lockout standard on OSHA's list of top lockout citations. Now that's just within lockout here that I'm talking about. Lockout itself was number 5 overall in OSHA's top 10. But the first one on here, just talking lockout specifically, is the energy control procedure. This is not having those equipment-specific energy control procedures, or having them, but they're inadequate. The standard requires that employers must develop, document, and utilize these procedures for the control of that potentially hazardous energy. When your employees are working on this equipment, that energy that can really come out and bite them. The second one on there is the energy control program. Not having a program in place that includes all the elements, that outline your lockout processes. Having generic programs that aren't very company specific. We're going to talk about those top 2 here in great detail, the actual procedure and the program, so we'll dig down into that. The third one, the periodic inspection, not reviewing your procedures in the authorized workforce, that their responsibility under those procedures. There's many failures around this for a variety of reasons, keeping these things up to date. Things change and move, and companies really got to be on their toes to keep those energy control procedures updated and current. The next one, training and communication. Providing adequate training to the workforce specific to their duties. Many companies struggle with this, and I guess kind of maybe take the easy way out when you talk about web-based training or video training that's not specific. When OSHA walks in, they're going to gauge the employee's level of understanding of lockout and the practices at your facility. So it really needs to be tailored to your specific lockout tagout program. Not saying that the web-based training and video training is bad. It just cannot be the only training that you provide. So that's kind of why you see that up there in the 4th slot there. And we talked about device application. So clearly having a sound lockout program goes way beyond having the right locks, tags, and devices. So the companies really need to have a clear roadmap that outlines their lockout practices. I'll talk a little bit about the written program. A defined written lockout program, it's important for a variety of reasons. First, by taking the time to develop a written program, your company goes through the process of identifying some key risks and issues that your employees face when it comes to the maintenance and servicing of equipment. It provides a single shared understanding of the program as a whole, and a means to enforce consistency at each facility across the company, if that's applicable. A written program also provides a clear set of guidelines to implement and sustain a lockout program, and this ensures not only is it well established on the front end, but also evolves with the changes within the business and the regulatory environment. We'll talk more about programs falling out of when they're not current and some of the reasons behind that. Finally, it outlines a company's plan to comply with some of those regulations and policies. But to be effective, the program again has to be specific to your company and aligned with operational practices. It has to make sense. It has to include all the regulatory elements, of course. But it has to be accepted, understood, and followed by your authorized workforce. And we'll definitely spend spend some time talking about, accepted and being understood and followed by the workforce here coming up here. Some common failures that you run into when we talk about a lockout program, common failures that I've run into out in industry when we talk about the lockout written program. The first one up there, generic. Many companies have an overall lockout program or policy. Oftentimes these are, they can be generic, and it's not down to the site level. You really have to fill in the blanks in the area. So they're not site specific. Sometimes they're not even business specific. And those programs that aren't specific, they are very limited in their value and effectiveness. Being out of date, companies often fail to establish, the rigor around, making sure that it's reviewed and it's updated on a continual basis. That plus the change in personnel can lead to a program, falling out of step with the changes in the business or regulatory changes. You find this a lot with high turnover in companies. It might be the safety position, or everyone wants to come in with their own way of doing things, and if you don't really do it the right way, when you're talking about the implementation piece, it starts to get very, very fragmented and easily falls out of date, causes a lot of confusion. Lack of follow-through. Companies, say they have a program document in place, but they haven't actually implemented the program on the facility floor. Some facility employees may not even be aware of the document. So, following through with the program is critical to establishing, an effective lockout program. My experience out there, going out there and reviewing company lockout programs and trying to identify some gaps and helping them improve. It's amazing when you start digging into, do you have a written program? Well, I think so. I think we did at one point. Let me look. Oh, yeah, here it is. And some managers, no, I don't think we do. They have it. It might be 5 years old or whatever the case is, but normally they have one in some form, but they don't know what it is, or it's been so long, it's out of date. It really means nothing at that point. The next one, the lack of involvement. Failure, when you fail to involve authorized employees early in the program development process. This can result in some conflict between the program and the realities of the work environment. It can make the program the implementation very, very difficult. The best way to disengage an employee is to develop that program, kind of in a bubble or behind closed doors with no involvement. There's no one better to help create the program than those frontline employees, those authorized employees, those ones, the employees that are out there living it every day. They know what works. They know what doesn't work. They know the history. You have to gather, that most important voice, and that voice is the voice of the authorized workforce. Really to get their buy-in. Anyone can, sit down and go to the internet and download a nice fancy lockout program and make it look all great, but you don't follow through with it, not going to work. You don't gather that voice, it's not going to work. And the last one on there is a lack of understanding. There are many causes for a lack of understanding. When training, is kind of a check the box exercise, not specific to the actual company's specific procedure, when there's no component, no way to gauge the level of understanding. We talk about the web-based training and video training, and that's the only component of your training. You're not getting out there hands-on. You're not talking about your specific procedures. You're not teaming that new employee up with a mentor out there, going out to the machines, walking him through the procedures. That really causes a lack of understanding and puts the employees at risk. All right. So effective program creation. Where do you start? It really starts with building the framework of your program. I talked a little bit about generic and all that stuff, but don't recreate the wheel. There's all kinds of starting points out there that you can follow. Just be careful not to fall into that generic trap. You really have to do your due diligence and make sure it's developed the right way, and we'll talk more about that. Some companies might be starting from scratch. But, you know, the majority, unless you're a brand new facility, new company, most, you know, will have a history of some lockout tagout practices. I've been to, you know, companies that have had very effective programs at one site, very large companies. You go to one site and, man, they really got their stuff together. Employees are engaged. Everyone's bought in. They're following it. It looks great. And then you go to the same company but a different facility the next town over, or maybe it's the next state over, and it's a mess. And you know, there's an issue there. But always benchmark within, you know, your own company, you know, first. What's going on at other sites. More than likely, there's some best practices that you can pull from coworkers and sister sites and things. And then also other companies. Definitely benchmark, but do not try to recreate the wheel, because people have been there and done that. Involve employees every step of the way. Listen to your employees. You know, again, involve employees every step of the way. You know, this means reaching out to the subject matter experts, the ones that will be utilizing lockout out in the field. You know, you'd be amazed at what you'll learn. I do a lot of interviews with authorized employees for some companies, and you know, a lot of times it's eye-opening. You know, for myself, but definitely the customer. You know, that brought me in just to hear, you know, what they have to say. I mean, there's nothing better to learn about what's going on out in your facility than to sit down and listen to them. It's absolutely fantastic. You know, this includes some fact finding to determine what the current state is. You know, what are the current practices and what's happened in the past? You might find that you once had a very robust program. Everything was in place, and then it fell by the wayside due to, you know, who knows, lack of, you know, sustainability measures, high turnover that we talked about, not having accountability in place or management of change process. But you really have to know what your current state is to determine what's worked in the past, what's failed in the past, and really what's currently working or not working. And you know, think beyond, you know, again, the basic tools. You know, yeah, we got locks, tags, and procedures hanging on the equipment. We're good to go. Yes, they have to be in place and available, but you have to dig deeper into, you know, that employee's understanding of the lockout process and how they're applying it out in the field. Again, you can have the best looking program on paper, but if they don't understand it or aren't applying it out in the field, your process is failing. Okay, so you have to make sure you include all the required elements. I'm not going to go into each one of these in detail. I am going to pick out a few of these, the ones that we want to, you know, I call them the, you know, just the very critical ones, but you have to include all the elements in your program. No two lockout programs are going to be exactly the same. Yours has to be tailored to fit your business. And again, I'll be talking a little bit more in depth about some of these elements. So to get started, building your program, you have to get to know your workforce, and you have to get to know the type of work that's being performed out there in the facility. So, you have to understand this so you can be able to appropriately identify your authorized workforce. Determining who in your company is authorized, it's a critical step. An authorized employee is a person who locks or tags out machines in order to perform servicing or maintenance on that machine or equipment. Lockout is required when an employee is required to remove or bypass a guard or any other safety device. So when they start interacting with the piece of equipment, that triggers lockout tagout. This normally includes site maintenance technicians, engineers, and equipment operators. But you have to make sure you completely understand the type of work your employees get involved with, which might trigger that lockout. It can sometimes seem to be easier to just authorize everyone without completely understanding how they interact with the equipment, or leave it up to the equipment operator to determine, if the task requires lockout. You really have to do your due diligence here. Equipment operators, they definitely need special attention. You talk about maintenance technicians and all that. They're getting into the equipment. They have to be highly skilled, trained. And, normally they're all authorized employees when it comes to lockout, tagout, just because of the type of work they do. Then you talk about equipment operators, and, they might do some adjustments, we talk about minor servicing but different things where they have to bypass to change something, to adjust something, to clean something, and does that, does that require, lockout, tagout, or does it not require lockout, tagout? Sometimes that can be, a little hard, even for skilled safety professionals to determine what's minor servicing and what's not. And you definitely don't want to leave that up to an operator to make that determination. So you definitely have to get out there and see what they're doing, see how they're interacting with the equipment to determine, hey, do they need to be authorized or not? Or, hey, can we do this job a little bit better so we do not have to authorize this job? A great way to accomplish this is through a JHA, a JSA, Job Hazard Analysis, Job Safety Analysis, whatever you call it, program. These programs should be an integral part of any company's safety program, and especially for lockout, tagout. There are many times when, like I said, machines can't be fully locked out. You have to go through every step to see is it testing the position? Are they troubleshooting? Does it require lockout? Does it meet minor tool? Is it minor tool changes? Does it meet the minor servicing requirements? But they all have to be fully reviewed to ensure that risk is mitigated, and then you have the right controls in place to protect, really to protect your employees. Now, I'd like to talk about some key processes that every lockout program, really needs to have, no doubt. First one, group lockout. Group lockout applies when more than one employee is engaged in the maintenance or servicing tasks on the piece of equipment. When servicing or maintenance is performed by a crew, a craft, a department, or other group of employees, which can include contractors coming in on site, a procedure must be utilized and followed that gives each employee, working on that job, the same level of protection. It's equivalent to that provided as personal lockout. So they all have to have some personal control of that piece of equipment, so no one can just go up and flip a switch and turn it on and get someone injured. So personal control of that hazardous energy. There are many different options for a group lockout, and the one that you choose needs to align with your business practices, and definitely included and spelled out in detail in your written lockout program. Covering just a couple of them, the most simplistic and widely used option is the use of a HASP. So, a HASP is something that you put on an energy isolation point, usually accepts up to 6 locks, and then you place the lock on the HASP. This makes it more convenient for another authorized employee to apply their lock. So anyone going out to do a job, common practice, always put a HASP on first, put your lock on. That's just in case someone else comes and needs to look at something or help you with the job. That HASP is there, and it can accept that other authorized employee's lock. So it's convenient, it's there. If not, they say, oh man, we got to take your lock off, put a HASP on, this and that. That's where the convenience comes in. Using HASP for group lockout are a great option when there's a small number of energy sources or a limited number of authorized employees working on a job. Another commonly used practice for group lockout is the use of a group lockbox. Under the lockbox process, all energy sources are de-energized and locked out by a designated authorized employee or employees. They de-energize, say there's 6 isolation points, they go and they de-energize and isolate those 6 isolation points. And the keys to those locks from those isolation points are put back into a group lockbox. So the keys are in a group lockbox. Every authorized employee that is assigned to the job then puts their personal lock on the lockbox. So if there's 3 authorized people working on the job, there's 3 locks on the lockbox, and all the keys that has that energy isolated on that piece of equipment are locked in that lockbox. So no one can get into those keys until that last lock is off. And there's a lot of different variations when you talk about that, the group lockbox process and other processes out there. So there's a lot of information out there. When you get into very complicated process type environments, this process expands, but the main thing behind it is employees have to have personal control of their safety. So those are 2 common ones. The next process up here is shift or personnel changes. For shift or personnel changes, you have to have specific procedures, during these changes to ensure the continuity of lockout protection. including, a provision for orderly transfer of lockout device protection between the off-going and oncoming employees to minimize exposure from that piece of equipment becoming energized or starting up. So really what it means is once servicing starts on a piece of equipment, the equipment needs to stay in a locked out state until the job is done and the equipment is ready to return back in service. So if you're working on a piece of equipment and it's not done, you just can't take your lock off and go home and then come back and work on it, the next morning. It needs to stay in a locked out state. So a couple different options used out in industry for shift change that definitely needs to be incorporated in your written program. And the best option, the one that I recommend, if it's feasible, at the facility, is for the direct transfer between authorized employees. So this is the oncoming authorized employee places their lock, on that hash that we talked about on the energy isolation device, and the off-going employee removes their lock. So it's a direct transfer, and this can sometimes be led by the supervision or the team leads on the shift. But it offers that, that face-to-face at the machine. You talk about the status of the machine, what's going on with the machine. It's just a great way, best option to do it. But sometimes that face-to-face contact it just can't happen. So the second option, I'll talk about is the utilization of some type of shift transfer device. This is, when authorized employees, it continues over multiple shifts, and again, there's no immediate handoff. So you need some type of device that they can put on there in the meantime to span that time before the next person comes and works on that piece of equipment. So the authorized individual that was performing the work places a shift transfer device on the energy isolation devices. The authorized employee that was performing the servicing or maintenance remove his or her personal tag. The key to this transfer lock, has to be closely controlled by a supervisor. Sometimes you hear them called the supervisor lock, so it requires a supervisor to come out to the job with the employee working. They'll put the supervisor lock on. That employee will take his lock off the next shift coming in. Supervisor will go out with the new authorized employee. They'll go to the machine, talk about the status, follow the lockout steps. The authorized employee will put their lock on, then the supervisor will take that supervisor lock off. But it has to be a very controlled process, and that key needs to be controlled. And work cannot be performed when you work under shift locks or supervisor locks. Only when that transfer has been complete and that new authorized employee begins work. But the main thing there, you have to have a really robust shift change process, and that needs to be embedded into your written program. Another key process, testing and positioning. This, when power must be temporarily restored to a machine to test or position it, OSHA requires that a certain procedure must be followed. This includes clearing jams, removing employees, removing devices, energizing and conducting your testing and positioning, and reapplying lotto. So they allow you to midstream when you're working to re-energize a piece of equipment to do testing and positioning, but at no time do they say you can ever put an employee in harm's way. You can never be in the danger area. You can never be in the danger zone. The procedure is for observation purposes only. Where these minor adjustments and the positioning can be made outside of the danger area. You see a lot of confusion around this. You see the word, I hear the word troubleshooting be abused out in the, I had to get in here to the point of operation because I'm troubleshooting. Well, they never say you can't put yourself in harm's way. So you need clear guidance when we talk about testing positioning in your program. The next one, removing another person's lock. This is another critical process that needs to be in the written program. This is if you have to remove a lock when somebody leaves it on and goes home for the night. They might have been done with the job. They might not have been done with the job, but OSHA requires that there needs to be a verification, that makes sure that the employee's not on site and available to move their lock and tag, whatever might be on there. Checking that the new employee coming on is not going to be exposed to any hazard. Verify the equipment's safe to operate. The guards have been replaced. A process that has to be followed to be sure before they go and take bolt cutters to that lock that all your I's are dotted and your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. to make sure that this piece of equipment is 100% safe. And this also has to be a documented process. So those forms and everything should be in your written program. And the last one on here is out of service equipment. This really is not part of, really the OSHA standard or requirements. I put it in here. I like to include it in the written program just because it is critical and there's a lot of confusion around this. Lockout locks are for lockout, tagout only. So if you have a machine that is out of service for some production reason or whatever it might be, it's not actively being worked on, that needs to be a completely separate lock, not related to lockout, tagout. It's out of service. So, that needs to be, I build it into the program just because you have to clearly identify that. But lockout locks are definitely for lockout, tagout only. Next step, it's time to conduct a full review to determine what types of devices are required out there. This requires you to go out with the subject matter experts, the ones that are very, very familiar with the processes and the equipment to determine, how this equipment is supposed to be isolated. This can also be done in conjunction with the procedure development, which I'll be talking about here in a couple minutes. But it's not just buying a bag of devices and hoping it includes everything. It's funny going, not funny, but interesting when you go out and, how's lockout? Oh, great. Yeah, we got locks. We follow it. We do everything. Well, how do you lock out this ball valve? Oh, well, kind of silence. Good question. We don't really have a lot of devices. You dig a little bit deeper and, they do have some holes. They don't have all the devices that they need. So, providing locks, tags, and devices, it's important, definitely for some obvious reasons. Without them, the equipment can't be kept at a zero energy state, but not any device or lock will do. I mean, there's a lot of them out there, and you really got to make sure that, what you're picking, you got to test it to make sure that it works. So it's important to have the proper device. If it doesn't fit that specific control point, it's going to be easily bypassed, and it's not going to work. So they also have to lend, for the personal control. So, all these devices, they need to accept the lock on there. You just can't put a device on and leave it like that if it can be easily bypassed. So a lot of different options out there. So, it's important to recognize that, they also need to be at the point of need or somewhere that's easily accessible. When you talk about maintenance, employees, a lot of times will have them on their cart, or they keep them with you because they're all over the plant. When you talk about operators that have a specific need, they're out at their machine all day. You don't want to put their devices somewhere on the other side of the plant. If they have to lock something out once a day or once every 2 days or 5 times a day or whatever it is, you need to make it convenient for them. So put it at their point of use. If it's a ball valve device or gate valve device or whatever, that is definitely their locks and tags and everything with them. But put it out there. When they're not easily located, it makes it very easy for them to miss a step when we talk about devices. All right, so now we're going to change gears a little bit here and talk about some equipment specific lockout procedures. These procedures, they must be formally documented and must identify the equipment, that it covers. They should detail the specific steps necessary for shutting down, isolating, securing the equipment to control, the hazardous energy. These procedures are absolutely critical for worker safety, and there's a huge gap out there in industry. One, of just having these things, two, keeping them up to date. Three, making sure they're readily accessible and the employees understand them. So, without procedures, workers run the risk of, skipping, some steps during the lockout process. These definitely outline the right way, the order in which you need to safely de-energize and lock out this equipment. So without these, it definitely opens up your risk, increases your risk for serious accidents and injury. However, just having procedures, it's not enough. It's also important for them to be, I call it, machine or task specific. They need to be visually intuitive. Step-by-step procedures are more and visually, procedure are more easily understood. The more likely to be followed by the members of your authorized workforce. And we talk about, task-specific type procedures. OSHA's looking for that too. Task-specific meaning you might have a piece of equipment that has 30 isolation points and a bunch of different components. And you have a task or something that you need to work on a certain component, and it's not feasible to de-energize this entire system, but you can safely de-energize and separate this component that you want to work on. But the procedure only says, here's how you bring down the entire piece of equipment. Well, I can't do that for this certain task, so that would not be acceptable. It has to be down to the task-specific level. So some common failures seen out there in the industries. The first one, misuse of generic procedures. Companies will sometimes use generic procedures thinking it's okay because the equipment is similar, and sometimes when you have very similar equipment, you can use a procedure that covers a group, but even subtle differences between the equipment, the differences in magnitude of energy, the difference in shutting the equipment down, just small changes, often requires another procedure to be used. So always best practice that I followed is always to create their own procedures, or add in a statement to a preventative maintenance work order that states the equipment must be locked out. Something kind of generic. Step 1, lock out the equipment. While that's a great reminder, it doesn't provide enough information. You have to have the equipment specific procedures. It should refer back to that procedure, or have that procedure embedded in the work order system with whatever system that you have. Out of date procedures is another big one. When machines are moved, they're are changed, procedures don't get updated. OSHA requires that there's a periodic review where you should catch some of these. But sometimes that doesn't happen. The result is procedures that fall out of date. Omitting energy sources, a lot of times stored energy, residual energy, and how to control it often is overlooked on the procedures. So we really have to make sure that all energy sources are accounted for. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Overly complicated. It might seem great to write a book on how to de-energize, and some processes might require that, but the ones that don't, you don't want to overcomplicate it. They might seem thorough, but the ones that are too complicated, the ones that are difficult to understand, they're not followed as frequently as the procedures that are easy to understand. It just makes it very, very complicated. Employees need they need information, in an easy to follow and an easily understood type format. Not readily available, pretty self-explanatory. Procedures need to be available. So post it on the machine, nearby, tablets, whatever it might be. But when maintenance is out there, it needs to be easy. They shouldn't have to go hunt down these procedures that to de-energize a piece of equipment. And you see it a lot out there. Back in a binder, a dusty binder in the back of the maintenance shop, you see them buried in a shared drive somewhere. Hey, where's your procedures? Well, I think they're out here under this folder and this da-da-da. And, no one's going to find it. No one's using it. So that they need to be out there so the authorized workforce can use them. Lack of verification steps, typically overlooked. Verify zero energy on what you're working on, and then not listing out the devices. So making sure that you specify what devices are needed, you specify how many locks are needed to work on that piece of equipment. So how do we do it? How do we start to tackle equipment-specific procedures? Well, you have to start with an accurate inventory, number one. This includes a full review to determine what pieces of equipment need a procedure first and foremost. OSHA requires that you develop procedures, document them for the control of hazardous energy, for your equipment in your workplace. Now there are exceptions to that. Cord and plug equipment not included in the lockout standard. They have an exception. I'm not going to get into it in detail. But if you're not familiar with it, it's buried right there in the 1910.147 standard, and it has to meet one of 8 criteria to not have an equipment-specific procedure. And best practice I've followed when it comes to that, instead of trying to meet one of these 8 or all 8 of these exceptions, is I developed the procedures for the majority of the equipment, beyond the cord and plug single energy source type equipment. Always a best practice. You have to get the right people involved when you're out there developing these procedures. The subject matter experts are key. Those are the ones that are familiar with the equipment and the energy sources. I've been out there writing procedures in the past during my career as a safety professional, and I always have someone right next to me when I'm going out there and identifying the energy sources and how to isolate it and all that. And my role was mainly administrative. I went back and used the template, whatever we were working with at the time, and plugged it in. But I relied solely on those experts to do that. So do not try to tackle it yourself. Don't bite off too much. Writing procedures can be a huge task. It can be hundreds or thousands in these facilities, and start with a department or a group of like machinery. Get comfortable with it, work out the kinks in your process, and then move on to the next one. Don't try to tackle it all in one fell swoop, because it's a very large project normally. Address real world tasks, and we talked about this. This is the task specific type procedure when you not feasible to bring down this entire process line or whatever it is. I have to work on this component and safely on this component. So how do you do that? That procedure needs to reflect that, and then verify for accuracy. Don't trust anything when it comes to these procedures. When I went out there and wrote these, you can mistype something, you can miss something when you're out there, just forgot, didn't know about some stored residual, whatever it is. Don't trust it. One of the most important steps, and sometimes it's not easy to verify these things on the fly because of production. You can't bring the equipment down, but the next time that piece of equipment needs to be brought down or used, verification is part of the process anyway. But these procedures definitely need to be reviewed for accuracy. A very, very important step. So understanding these procedures, this is just an example of a procedure. It just happens to be one from Brady's Link 360 software. They come in a variety of different looks and feels and all that stuff. But the visual lockout procedures, they include photos of the energy isolation points. They become really recognized as a best practice as they provide clear, visually intuitive instructions for those authorized employees to follow. When employees can easily understand the procedures, they're more likely to utilize it, as we talked about a couple slides back. So this is just again an example up here, and some of the things that you see that you definitely want to see on a procedure. A description, what is the equipment? A lot of times there's different types of equipment IDs and things like that the company understands or recognizes that equipment by. The location, where's it at? The notes section is important. Certain things that you can put different hazards and warnings in there. The piece of equipment might have capacitors or something. Warning, let the machine sit for 15 minutes to dissipate the energy or bring it to ground or whatever that might be. The lockout application process. So these are the steps. These are kind of the high-level steps that you need to follow when it comes to lockout tagout that OSHA wants to see. This is what you're training your employees on. From notifying the affected employees to verifying total de-energization of all sources. So those are the overall steps. On the back side of this, I'll show you. It explains those in a bit more detail. So that's some of the information. Then some more information, the building, the ID, not going to go into detail on this, but talk about some the critical stuff. The revision date or date created. Very important. When it was created, when was it revised? Now, this doesn't have to be revised every year. OSHA requires that you review, you do a periodic inspection on your procedures on an annual basis, but you don't have to revise them on an annual basis. Some companies will have a spot to put a sticker to say reviewed, because it has to be reviewed annually somewhere on the document, but not a requirement. That can be held somewhere else, like in this system, Link 360, that tracks everything in an online database. It can be an Excel spreadsheet, it can be handwritten, whatever, but you have to have documentation on when you reviewed those procedures. Lockout points. How many locks do you need? You know, right off the bat when you're going out to work on this equipment. Very visual, jumps out at you. The photos we've talked about, very visually intuitive. And then on the bottom, before we get to the meat of this, is the lock removal process. So once you're done with the job, everything has been wrapped up. Here's what you need to do to put that piece of equipment back into service when you're done working on it. All right, so now this is the meat. This is, you know, this is really the meat of any procedure when we talk about the equipment-specific procedures, and sometimes this is where, you know, the gaps are. This is where people, you know, miss the energy sources. But the energy source, lockout steps, you know, electrical, where is it located? You can even put in things, you know, PP requirements. You have to get into a cabinet or something. You need to turn the disconnect to the opposition. What equipment do you need to be able to work on that, a lock or a hasp? You know, the gas, you know, saying that you need a gate valve device. So it covers the source, the steps, the methods, and then also the location where all those are. So very visually intuitive, makes it really hard, you know, to miss some of these energy sources. The back side of this is just kind of an overall guideline for those authorized employees, kind of a refresher. This is everything that your authorized training should include. But, you know, the required components, OSHA requires a purpose and the scope and the enforcement on these procedures. And then I told you the shutdown and tag out the procedure. These are the steps with more description behind those. Again, with the removal of your lockout, returning it back to service has those steps, but gives you more detail on that. So just kind of a nice little you know, guideline for those authorized folks to make sure they're not missing any steps when they go through and they're going through and working on these pieces of equipment. Then right here, labeling the isolation points, another best practice. You know, OSHA from the lockout standard, and I'm just talking specifically lockout, not electrical standard of having things labeled. From a lockout standard, you know, always it's a best practice to you know, have these correlate. So you know, to further clarify this, you know, that you have the E1 on the energy source there on the procedure, and then you can tag the actual disconnect exactly where that is to align with the picture to say, here's where E1 is, turn it to the opposition and put your lock on it. So it really gets rid of the confusion on exactly where E1 is, because sometimes it can be confusing, big, complicated pieces of equipment with numerous energy sources. Where one valve has to be left open, one has to be shut, whatever it might be. This makes it very clear on what needs to be de-energized, the location of it, so it gets rid of a lot of that confusion and reduces the chance for error. All right, that was kind of the presentation, but you know, in conclusion, yeah, a successful lockout program goes way beyond just the tools. It takes a full understanding of your business. It takes a full understanding of the task performed, you know, at your facility. It takes getting the right people involved to ensure success. Don't try and do it yourself. Don't try and do it behind closed doors. Thanks and good luck. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Scott. We do have a few questions here, and Scott, if you would take your best crack at answering these for us. First question is, if we hire a contractor to do service or construction work at our facility, is our company responsible for providing lockout tagout materials regardless of who owns the equipment being used?
The answer to that is normally no. So contractors, if they're on there, they're you know, supervising their own employees. Contractors have a responsibility for the safety of their own employees. So I worked for contract employees, outsourced process and facility maintenance for a long time. And we'd go into facilities when OSHA came knocking on the door. If our employees, they look at us. They look at your company if you're the contractor. You need to have a program. You need to have a lot of times, procedures and devices and everything for your employees. You're responsible for your employees, but there's also a shared thing when it comes to lockout, tagout, and contractor safety, where you need to be aware of each other's programs, things like that. But when it comes down to ultimate responsibility, it's whoever who those employees report to, so the contractor. Good question.
Okay, another question here is, our equipment is used in high heat environments. Do we have to account for heat in our lockout procedure?
Absolutely. So heat, it's an energy source. It's a hazardous energy. So if it has the potential to to injure your employees when they're working on it, that is a source of hazardous energy. So that should be listed as an energy source on your lockout tagout procedure, with a safe way to dissipate that heat and to work on the equipment safely.
Okay, I've got one more question for you here, Scott. For machines that use power cords and extension cords, does OSHA require the use of plug cap covers to lock out the cord ends for this equipment?
Yeah, so cord and plug, kind of exempt from lockout tagout and the standard. Definitely the best practice when you're working on any type of equipment that could be re-energized is always put plug cover on it and put a lock on it, especially if you're going to be walking away from the piece of equipment where somebody could come up. So then you would definitely want to put a plug cover on it. Good question.
Thank you for answering our questions, Scott. And thank you to all for attending today's webinar. In the near future, you will receive an email directing you to a replay of the webinar and the associated documents. Also watch your email for announcements about future webinars, and be sure to visit the ASA website at www.asa.net. Please remember that this Lockout Tagout webinar is the first of 2 parts. The second webinar will take place on April 7th. Thank you everyone for your participation, and have a safe day.